Sean mentioned that we have some good banter here. He brought it up, not me, so I'll go ahead and explain what we got going on. You're familiar with the channel Rev. Well, I was the editor of the book, uh, Current Issues in Soteriology, which was presented at a symposium by the International Society of Newton. And he gave it a really good review, but he said it was the most boring title he'd ever come across, right? Like, okay, that's one off, right? You know, that happens. And then he's reviewing another book, Grace and Truth, Volume 2, in which I have an article entitled Meta Hermeneutics and Dispensation. And as the title suggests, the picture is about meta hermeneutics and dispensationalism. And he gave it a really good review. But he said, man, that's a terrible title. What are you doing, Paul? I'm like, okay, well, that's two, right? Two is already a coincidence, right? Three titles, that's a trend. So we got to talking about perhaps some not real. He said, okay. And I said, what about this as a title? Biblical social ontology. Is that a good title? He said, that's the worst. It's a bad title. It's the third one. You are witnessing the beginning of a trend, guys. This is great. So, biblical social ontology, the worst title for a sermon this year so far. Granted, it's only January 4th. What is this about? Biblical social ontology. Maybe I should start a little bit from the beginning. Um, I was born at a very young age here in southern Louisiana, in Lafayette. And, like an idiot, I left and ended up in Southern California, where I got saved in the 90s or the 80s through a program called Awana, which is a children's ministry Minnesota. Awana in Southern California, by the way, in the 80s was the first ministry to stand up to John McCain in the 80s when he was formulating social salvation. So I got to be saved to a very early pre-grace movement ministry. Bounced around a little bit more, ended up in Texas in the 90s in another pre-grace church. So I benefited so much from the pre-grace movement and fellowship. I wanted to be a missionary to Eastern Europe, so I became an immigrant church. I moved to Ukraine in 2011. Met Lena in the back there. We fell in love, all that hippie stuff, got married, and started Grace Abroad Ministries in 2016 with translation teaching outreach to promote all of Grace teaching in Eastern Europe. In 2021, we came to America just for a short 6-month trip before planning to attend February 14th, 2022. However, Russia mass peak on the borders of Ukraine and escalated to the war that actually very good. And we've been kind of different. So there's been a lot of confusion that I'm seeing in America revolving around current events around political ideology. So I'm working on a biblical response to that in terms of political ontology using academic thought. This is the okay, so a lot of the confusion is coming from a lot of statements that are being made in America. For example, this is H.R. Cyril, he says that the invasion of Ukraine is a holy war, and that Russia is sending killing the missionaries and trainers and people. Now, there's something attractive about this, right? I mean, we look at a lot of the problems in America, and some might say, well, maybe America does need a Christian. Well, one point of caution is simply that this is not the voice of the Christian people. Christianity has this message that you can believe in Jesus and salvation. Is that what Orthodox teaches? No. The Russian Orthodox Church, in the words of H.R. Cyril, teaches that someone dies in the line of military duty, and you believe that this sacrifice washes away from all the things that Christians do. This is a message of pluralism and someone going to atoning ways in salvation. This is not a message of salvation. There's been a lot of Russian propaganda that we only really saw in the Russian language until this particular interview with Pascal from the Mishdak, Alexander Dugin, leading Russian philosophers of the ideology of Russism. All of a sudden, we start to see a lot of Russian ideology emerging in the evangelical congregation, frequently with the particular Calvinist crisis, and there's not recognized here. So I've been working on a dissertation refuting this ideology deliberately. I've become probably what seems like the leading scholar on Alexander Puget, which is not a very great claim to fame. uh, so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So first, let's talk about the actual ideologies that are prevalent, because that's where a lot of the pressure happens. Frequently, whenever I see a Christian abandon the faith, often it's because they shift their ideas about politics and the way things ought to be and what kind of utopia we should strive for. They make that political change, and then they shift their worldview in terms of what actually is what the Bible says, what God is, in order to make it fit. So the worldview of Russism is a political ideology that positions itself as the force of four political ideologies. The first is liberalism, which is followed by communism, and then fascism, and then Russism is kind of a modification, most like fascism. So the first ideology is liberalism. Now, when we say liberal here in America, we typically speak of leftism. That's not really liberalism in the classic term. Liberalism, classically speaking, is the ideology that America was founded upon. It emphasizes the individual. So a sample text from liberalism as a political ideology might be the Declaration of Independence, where we see statements such as all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among them their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You see how we presuppose the existence of an intelligent designer who kind of has a plan for society. You see how we see the individual as a significant part of that. That would be liberalism. Now, liberalism was carried out in the West and ended up with inequality, which you would expect. There was some in poverty, as Jesus said, was one of in poverty, and some became very rich. So a solution to the perceived injustice would be communism. Communism was formulated by Karl Marx, who's kind of the main guy there. A communism sample text would be from this essay, in which Karl Marx makes a famous statement that communism is the opiate of the people. Um, Communism basically sees two groups, the rich and the poor. And the rich are oppressing the poor. It's an economic group. Communism has failed every time it's been tried. The first great failure was in the Soviet Union. So whenever they attempted a Leninist version of Marxism and it started falling apart, some political theorists in Germany started looking at that and trying to figure out a way to fix it. So we end up with what we call the Frankfurt School. The classic Marxist idea is that there are two groups, the rich and the poor, it's an economic theory, and the rich oppress the poor. That doesn't work. So in the Weimar Republic, the Frankfurt School came up with the idea perhaps we can divide society into more than just rich and poor. We can still have rich and poor, but we can also have men oppressing women. We can have this race oppressing that race, and so forth. So we have several critical groups, and so they call it critical theory. It's still very much bent against God, but the basic notion is that it's not just the rich and the poor, but several critical groups. That's communism in a nutshell. Now, fascism started getting its grounding in Italy around that time. Giovanni Gentile is the big philosopher behind that. He is a very boring read if you want to look into him. But Benito Mussolini is the politician that made it popular. So perhaps some of his quotes would be most beneficial in understanding what fascism is. Now, because communism fails, the idea is that in communism, the idea is that we should distribute things equitably, and that if we just do this, naturally we'll have our utopia. That doesn't work. So basically, fascism starts with communism that says the state needs to take control and push us into a utopian society. Mussolini makes an interesting statement. He says, anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. You see the dissolving of the individual in favor of the collective. That's fascism in a nutshell. Uh, Another quote: "The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value." So fascism is often depicted as being a very spiritual worldview. Now, there was an interesting video that was played at the Democratic National Convention back in 2012 in which it made the following statement: "The government is the only thing we all belong to." You see why this statement would align more closely to fascism than liberalism. See how it's state control, right? I wouldn't even put this necessarily in communism, other than the fact that communism ultimately influenced fascism. This is the influence that we've seen in certain leftist ideologies. Remember what I said earlier about the individual being dissolved in favor of the collective? We had this statement come out last week from the new mayor of New York. "We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism." You see why this statement aligns very well with the fascist ideology as opposed to the communist. Okay, and certainly not with the liberal ideology. I'm not at this time criticizing, just trying to put it out there as to who belongs to which school of thought. All right, now fascism is most famous for its manifestation in the National Socialist Workers' Party. Remember what we said about the Frankfurt School and their critical theory. There are several critical groups cited in the press. There's a particular form of critical theory that emphasizes race. So the National Socialist movement said, hey, let's take this idea of fascism and state control, combine it with our new communism of critical race theory, and we'll have a new state-pushed agenda for clearing out everything other than the Aryan race in order to have our own civic utopia. That is the German form of fascism in a nutshell. Okay, so those are the first three: liberalism, communism, fascism. Russism is the one that's still a little bit obscure to most Americans. It's the idea that comes from the previous three. Now, in some of their literature, you can get some very condemning remarks. Paulo Coelho is a Russist from Italy. He wrote his dissertation on Alexander Dugin, in which he very openly speaks of the end of fascism being premature in 1945. The idea is that we killed fascism too quickly. We never gave it a really good chance to work its way out. We need to revise it and bring it back somewhat in order to see where it goes. Now, among significant fascist influences on Alexander Dugin and others would be these three: Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger, which were very prominent National Socialist Party members. Uh, in Dugin's own words, he speaks of the subject of communism being class, the subject of fascism was the government in the Italian version, or race in the German version. In liberalism, the subject is the individual, but in the fourth political theory, the subject is Martin Heidegger's concept of Dasein, which is a very weird and obscure philosophy that came out of that school of thought, basically saying that there are different modes of being, if you will, different civilizations, different cultures. He also emphasizes Carl Schmitt's theory of Großraum in the German, which is great space. The idea there being that we need to have continental powers, hence the justification for Germany expanding into Poland because there can be giant land masses rather than huge countries. So whenever you read the Russian language textbooks that are being taught in the Russian West Point kind of series, you can see their maps where they describe various poles that need to be distinguished, that Russia needs to expand out in order to unify giant land. That's about 6,000 people in the country. So, whenever we look at what Russism is, and its predecessor, fascism and communism, I think we see a lot of differences between that worldview and Christianity. Meanwhile, in the West, there's been some interesting discussions happening in philosophy on the topic of social ontology. One of the big leaders in that is this philosopher, Brian Epstein. I have no reason to believe he's awesome as he was, but he described social ontology as the study of the nature of the social world. What is X? Social ontology asks where X stands for any social thing whatsoever. So for the secularists exploring it, they're asking questions like, what is money? What are institutions? What are social groups? What is a credit card? Right? What are contracts? What are churches? What are families? What are governments? These are the questions that are happening right now in Western philosophy. I would suggest to you that the Bible is sufficient to answer these kinds of questions. And we can turn to the Bible for social ontology to understand how it is that God designed society. And if we understand how God designed society by reading the Bible, then we can look at ideologies such as liberalism, communism, fascism, and Russianism. We can look at these for biblical lens and evaluate them, criticize them. So that's the big question. What is God's design for society? If we read Genesis 1 through 11, and we read it very plainly, very literally, as Sean and I do, I think we can come to a realization that there are three basic units within society that all people are a part of by default. These are the individual, the family, and the country. That is to say that whenever you're born, you are an individual, you are a member of a family, and you are a member of a country. Typically, there are extreme circumstances. There are unfortunate deaths in childbirth where a child might be born an orphan. Maybe a stateless pirate off in the sea somewhere might be born without a country. Okay, when you're raised in this kind of environment, difficulties increase because I think that God really designed us to be a part of these three units: the individual, the family, and the country. So let's take a look at these three things through biblical lenses, and perhaps this can provide us some insight whenever we look at liberalism, communism, fascism, and Russia. Now, if you remember the development of these ideas, there was a very significant break that took place in the history of political ideology, right here, between liberalism and communism. Remember, liberalism, for all of its strengths and weaknesses, right, I think there are some serious problems that we can look at from liberal ideology. For example, whenever we have the founding of the United States, uh, the institution of chattel slavery was still legal. I find that to be self-contradictory. Whenever we say that all men are created equal, yet some are able to own others, that's a problem. And by the way, America fought a very bloody war to resolve that problem. But still, the idea of liberalism, which emphasizes the individual, there was a significant break whenever communism said we need to replace the individual with instead the collective. And that's an idea that we see carried on from communism, fascism, and post-fascist ideologies, such as the modern left and Russia. So whenever we talk about the individual, maybe it's helpful to look at other worldviews. Um, this is a book. If you look at the book cover on the right, you see that logo with the arrows pointing out. That's kind of the symbol of Russia's Russia's philosophers speak of the individual as being uh, seen in terms of manifestation. This author, from a Russian perspective, criticizes the biblical worldview, which says that there's a non-identity or a distinction between God and His creation. In this worldview, there is no distinction, right? We are nature. The trees are nature. We're all one. There's a little bit of a difference, but fundamentally we're all the same. Whenever we read the Bible, we can discuss the individual in terms of anthropology, which is one of the major categories of Christian systematic theology. And we see God creating man in His own image and putting him in the garden over the earth to subdue it, to rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that is on earth. So whenever we develop a biblical worldview of the individual, we see that man is created to be ontologically above nature. It's not that we're part of nature. It's not that nature is part of us. It's that we're above nature. Now we can discuss the details of what kind of responsibility that gives us for nature. But we need to realize that God has designed us to be above nature. We also see the concept of labor being instituted in the Garden of Eden, an individual responsibility. God gives directions and says, "The day that you eat of the fruit, you will die." Right? So from this, we can derive the concept of responsibility and labor. Right? Um, we see the facets of man developed throughout the Bible. There's the material and the immaterial. We see James say that the body without the spirit is dead. But there's also kind of a middle ground, if you will. So, for example, the material involves our tongue, lips, teeth, whereas the immaterial aspect of man includes the mind, the will, the image of God. Whenever we combine these together, we end up with our capacity for language. That's an interesting, unique aspect of humans over the animals. From that, we can derive our basic hermeneutics, in which we can read the Bible through the um, regular conventions of human language. That's where we get gender creationism and dispensationalism and all the wealth of truth that God has communicated using human language is something that we invented for. Of course, pagan hermeneutics will interfere with that. But another thing that we have is a group of physical traits and a self-awareness. Physical traits include our own sexuality. So we can discuss this middle ground of gender identity for how we interact with our own sexuality. Now, this is something that is under attack today by certain political ideologies, which try to push our gender identity and encourage people to identify outside of their physical sexuality. However, whenever we read the Bible, we see that God created man and woman, male and female, and that this is his design for society. Critical gender theory would be one form of the critical theory that came out of the Frankfurt School that is currently attacking the biblical social ontology, God's design for the individual. Okay, so those are some things we could talk about whenever we think about what the Bible says about the individual. What about the family? So this is another unit that we are part of by default. Now, one of the reasons that some people are attracted to Rushism is because Putin says that he stands for traditional values. Didn't we stand for traditional values? Aren't you in favor of traditional marriage? Well, what exactly is traditional marriage? Well, in Russia, there are several religious traditions out there. Speaking with a couple of leaders, Islam is a pretty significant deal there. Islam was founded by a pedophile and a warlord who had many wives, one of which was 9 years old. So there is a form of traditional marriage that is polygamy. Are we for traditional marriage or are we for biblical marriage? It happens that here in America, our tradition has historically been biblical, but I don't think it will be very long before we can look back on American history and say, well, it hasn't always been that way. We're already starting to make serious compromises there. We don't want to define marriage by tradition. We want to define it by the Bible. So what does the Bible say? One of the key passages would be right here in Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So the way this works is that a family basically has two components, two facets, if you will. The first is the marital facet, and the second is the parental facet. Whenever a man and a woman get married, they form a new family unit. They leave their parents, they become joined to each other, and they become one flesh. A result of the marriage is likely to be children. The children are born into this family unit, and then they grow up. Meanwhile, there's another family unit adjacent that is also having children growing up, and then a male from one and a female from another will leave and join and start a new unit. Okay, and this is how marriages and families are to grow and continue on, and then they have their babies. The problem is that sin has entered the world, and that will corrupt the family. One way that we see family as a unit being under attack today is through the ideology of homosexual marriage, which says that it doesn't have to be one man and one woman, it can be two men or two women. This does not fit the biblical definition of marriage. There's also the tendency toward polygamy, especially in countries where Islam is popular. or in the more Mormon influenced areas here in the United States. Probably the most common compromise that I'm seeing on the unit of family, though, is cohabitation. A man and woman will live together as if they are married without ever actually defining themselves as married. These situations can be rather messy, and it involves a lot of hassle they can figure out how to resolve. If this is your current living situation out in society, making it together. Okay, so that's the family. We talked about the individual, the family. The final unit of society is the country, which has, I would say, three factors. Now, you've mentioned earlier Russism, which sees the world as being a handful of civilizations that need to be united rather than several individual countries. I would say that in the Bible, we can derive three basic facets of the country. The first is that it's a distinct territory with a civil government that is there to protect the people in the land. There are two significant events in Genesis 1 through 11 to help us understand that. The first is the giving of the Noahic covenant after the Noahic flood, and the second is the total dispersion of Tower of Babel. Whenever we get to the Noahic covenant, we've just gotten through a dispensation where there was global debauchery. Everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes, kind of like our postmodern these. And that didn't work. So God destroys the earth and then gives man the instructions. If man sheds another man's blood, then by man his blood shall be shed. That is the basis for civil government. Then they are told to fill the earth, but they say, no, we're not going to fill the earth. Instead, we're going to gather together and make ourselves a name for ourselves in one little city, the Tower of Babel. So God comes down and scatters them across the earth. The instrument that he uses to scatter them is a confusion of languages. Languages is not the defining feature of a country, but it is what God used to refer to. In other words, if you are a French speaker in Louisiana, uh, the government is still obligated to protect you. They're not keeping independent from the English speakers or the Spanish speakers and so forth, right? Okay. Then we get this really interesting section in Deuteronomy 32:8, which says, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, and he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people. Now, what does this mean? So, this is where younger creationism, when it comes into fiction, gets really interesting. This is a chart of geologic time scale. Now, I would disagree with the numbers written here. I don't think that the Earth is to be viewed as these things happening over the course of millions of years, but rather much deeper time. However, the actual individual layers of rock are indeed legitimate. So we can break these layers up and divide them, and there's some interesting discussions happening in creation theology and creation biology and geology about which of these layers existed before the flood, which were laid during the flood, which were laid after the flood. I'm going to spare you from all the boring discussions that the geologists have and tell you that the flood basically, in my opinion, occurred below the KPG boundary so that everything from that rock layer up came after the flood. Now, here are some creation researchers who have looked through the fossil record of various humans, and they've identified which ones are humans, which ones are non-humans. And if we look at this, which is a chart of the dispersion of human fossils, it seems that the earliest dispersion of human fossils occurred during the Pleistocene era, which is right there on our chart. The Pleistocene is a fancy word for the ice age. Okay, so when we look at human fossil dispersion, it seems that they first began to disperse during the ice age. So when did the Tower of Babel likely occur? Probably during the ice age. Okay, here is a map of what the planet looks like probably during the ice age, according to some models. If you look closely, you might see that there are land bridges where there are not currently land. That's because you have more ice. More ice means less water. Less water means more land. That's why there's a concern about global warming, melting the ice and bringing the water up thinking out some coastal cities. So if this is what the world looked like at the time of the Tower of Babel's dispersion, then there would have been a lot more land that men could have walked across more easily. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what it could have looked like around the time that people dispersed from the Tower of Babel. Now, Deuteronomy 32:8 says that whenever God dispersed the nation, he set the boundaries to the people. What could that look like? Well, it could be that God used this time, whenever people dispersed, to collapse the ice age, which would increase the water supply and it would cut off people. Does that make sense? Okay. What else is interesting is that the end of the ice age did not simply cause a bunch of water in the ocean. It caused a whole lot of water catastrophes on river levels. So if you look at a map of free-flowing rivers, it looks something like this. Now, if you look today at a map of the world in the country, it'll look something like that. If you look carefully, you might notice that the lines between the countries are, to use the technical term, squiggly. Why are lines between countries squiggly? Because we use rivers and natural boundaries to separate them. I think that that's what God designed for us. I think He designed us to have several rivers and various boundaries that we could use for the purpose of separating the people in order to defend the country. Now, in Deuteronomy 32:8, it says that He did so according to the number of the children of Israel. There's some interesting textual variances in this, but it seems that God had Israel in mind whenever He did this. If you remember the Abrahamic covenant, which comes right after the Tower of Dispersion, He tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you." So it seems that countries are designed in a way, territorially speaking, to be separate from each other so that they can be defended. However, it is set up so that men can still traverse and get from country to country. With Israel in mind, this would be the idea of God using Israel as a light to the nation so that the world can know about Him. And of course, we're in a different dispensation now. We've left the Mosaic law behind and we're in the church age, but we still have this mission of making disciples of all the nations, which involves the necessity of getting around. So it seems that God has designed countries to be defendable, but still able to have discussion so that the word of God can still get out. Okay, so those would be the three facets of the country. The distinct territory with the civil government that's to protect the people in the land. All right, so in summary, what is a biblical social ontology? It's how we can look at the Bible and understand what God has designed societies to look like. Notice there's a lot of freedom whenever we think of these three units. Right? There's a lot of freedom in how a government can be set up. However, I think if whenever we get into our political discussions with our friends and our loved ones at Thanksgiving dinner or wherever else, we can keep in mind, wait a minute, is this idea that this particular politician thing, is that something that opposes God's design for me as an individual or for my family as a unit or even for the country as a whole? Okay, uh, that is all. I have to do, what do I do now? Do I do an alpha call or? Okay.